The Spoke Rohan Kishibe spin-off story is a companion series to the main story of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and it's full of a lot of supernatural encounters that Rohan has to deal with, and it makes sense that, given its status as a companion series, that it would draw elements from the main story of JoJo, specifically with the horror elements being taken mostly from Part 4, as that's the part with the most non-homo, non-stand-based paranormal activities. Though, it would also seem that one arc in the story itself was the groundwork for the basics of The Spoke, this being the final act of the July 15th arc of Part 4, Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick is the last of the 3 threats sent after the Duane Gang during the events of July 15th of 1999. And while it is the stand of Masazo Konito specifically, the stand itself is more so the antagonist of the fight than the user, due to his weak will and inability to manifest it correctly, resulting, in part, Cheap Trick becoming more of a supernatural force than a stand. Though before we get too into that, let's first understand the meaning behind his name and design. So to make it quick, Masazo Konito isn't actually much of a character. His name partly reflects this as well, as the Konito portion of his name specifically comes from the second of the heavenly stems, which is in part an Asian calendar system, and the context it's being used in doesn't seem to have much of a reason at all. Though his family name, Masazo, is comprised of 2 specific characters, the first one meaning standard or refined, while the second meaning third, and I feel this was chosen because Masazo was the third of 3 threats during this arc. Now, Masazo's character seems to have a couple of influences built directly into it. First, of course, his phobia, which seems to be a Araki taking the tagline of the seinen manga series Golgo 13 to a literal degree. This tagline is, "Don't stand behind him if you value your life," which was famous enough that Marvelous, when they made a DS game for Golgo 13, included a minigame where you would need to punch anyone who stood behind you. It was also likely the inspiration for Wamu's own personality quirk where he would attack anyone who entered his shadow. Though of course Masazo takes the wording of this tagline to its extremes, be it crawling along the walls, contorting his body in odd ways, or finally spider crawling up the stairs, which in itself is a direct reference to a deleted scene from The Exorcist, also that he could hide his back from unwanted observers. And this is all thanks to a phobia of his, one that existed before he actually had a stand, but would eventually be manifested into a physical form when he was struck with the arrow from behind by Yoshihiro Kira, and this phobia formed into the stand, Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick is an automatic sentient humanoid stand parasite which takes the form of a miniature human-like figure whose size and overall design seems to be based on the concept of the Amazonian shrunken head. It was even given what looks like a grass skirt to reference the tribals of the Amazon which would gather these shrunken heads. Though due to the minuscule size of the stand's body itself, it is pathetically weak compared to most other things, to the point that it can't even remove a bandage on its own. But its grip strength is actually strangely intense, and this is partly represented in Cheap Trick's own design by having suction cups on its fingers. But that is also done to play into its own design origins, as Cheap Trick is based directly on the yokai known as the Obrion, or more specifically the piggyback demon, a spirit from the rural areas of Japan's folklore that would lunge onto the back of travelers who were moving through the forest at night, and while on the back of the person specifically, they would become invisible to all around them and begin whispering demands into their victim's ear, which usually came down to bring the demon somewhere specific. And while attached to someone, it would be impossible to remove by normal means, though the traveler would have 2 options, either find some sort of magical way to remove it, or listen to the Obrion's demands. And all the time that they are traveling, the Obrion increases its own weight accordingly until eventually it crushes its target. So any misstep could result in a catastrophic issue later on. Though, if you're vigilant and struggle through the pain, once the Obrion reaches its destination, it will detach from the body and leave the victim with a large sack of gold equal to its own weight. The yokai itself is supposedly a metaphor that represents raising a child until eventually your hard work pays off, that child grows up and can bring you back more money. Though in the case of Cheap Trick, there's no positive side to this ability, as Cheap Trick is a stand with 2 abilities, or more easily understood, 1 ability and 1 rule. rule. So let's start with the rule first. How Cheap Trick works is that the stand will attach itself to anyone who looks at the back of its current host. And once attached, there is no traditional way of removing the stand, as it basically shackles itself to the soul of its victim and becomes their stand as well, even if they already have one. Along with this, previous victims of Cheap Trick have had their back ripped out and then all of their life force drained, reducing them to a doll-sized shriveled corpse, equivalent to that of a shrunken head. Also, if someone tries to remove Cheap Trick through a stand effect, it seems like this would affect its host as well, as seen when Rohan uses Heaven's Door on it and turns himself into a book, or when Koichi's Act 3 almost tears off Rohan's back. This is likely because Cheap Trick, as I mentioned, becomes his victim's own stand, so the rule of stand-on-stand combat applies to it. Though this is all just the rule of Cheap Trick, its actual ability is rather simple. Cheap Trick possesses the unstoppable ability of universal talking. The way this ability works is Cheap Trick will endlessly pester and prod his target by speaking to them and giving them tasks to fulfill, trying to get them to follow his commands in a way similar to the Obrian. He also talks with a specific verbal tick, where he ends all of his phrases with a Japanese character that is akin to okay. Universal talking is also an ability that allows Cheap Trick to communicate with others outside of its user, like when he calls in a bunch of food deliveries and emergency responders when Rohan bandages his ears shut. Along with this, Cheap Trick can use this ability to talk to non-stand users to instigate a fight between him and his victim. That way its user will be more prone to showing his back to others. Cheap Trick's talking ability also is, as I mentioned, universal, meaning that anything that can understand a command can understand it, which allows it to speak to animals as well and urge them to attack his host. Now, Cheap Trick gets its name from the American rock band formed in 1973 called Cheap Trick, named by the original members of the band because they were said to use every cheap trick in the book. And during their time performing, they found amazing success in Japan, with their fame being equated to that of the Beatlemania. And due to this, their tour album called Cheap Trick at Budokan was an album that helped get their name out there to the world. And around the time of Part 4 in Cheap Trick the Stand, the band had recently released one of their new albums called Woke Up With a Monster, which is a very controversial album for the band, but is widely appreciated in our modern time. Now, the name for the stand was likely chosen because of the ability's instigating nature, as it's perceived as a cheap trick of sorts, as his ability is essentially just annoying someone until they finally snap. Along with this, Cheap Trick being created out of Masazo's own paranoia about his back could be in reference to Woke Up With a Monster, as from the perspective of Masazo, he literally woke up one day with a monster on his back who whispered threats into his ears. Now, while the fight between Rohan and Cheap Trick is actually a pretty short one, it's also one of the best when it comes to versatility in a fight in Part 4 specifically, where the fight establishes one rule right away, and the rest of the fight is Rohan trying to figure out how he can cheat this Cheap Trick, even lying out loud to fool the stand so that it didn't know his real plan right up to the end when he finally defeats it, being able to finish it off when Rohan utilizes the Ghost Alleyway's own properties to remove Cheap Trick and banish it to hell. And with that finish to the fight, Rohan utilizing a supernatural element of Moriocho to deal with a stand, I feel like this was the groundworks for the Spoke series of stories. As not only is the stand itself a unique Araki blend of different cultures and horror elements, like most of the Spoke antagonists, but also Cheap Trick doesn't really feel like an enemy stand, if you know what I mean, but more so of a supernatural force that Rohan had to figure out and deal with. And it would seem that even Araki agrees with me, partly based on his quote about Cheap Trick. It's more of a supernatural creature than a stand. Also, it's assumed that Cheap Trick turned out the way it did partly because Masazo wasn't actually strong enough to control his own stand. Thus, it became the malicious attacker that it was. If you want to see what a finished version of Cheap Trick might have been like, Poco Loco's Hey Ya in Part 7 seems to be a positive spin on the ability, which doesn't surprise me too much, as Araki does tend to go back to his previous works and reuse them in later entries. And with that understood, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. And I heard that if you are able to actually beat Cheap Trick at his own games, then instead of turning into a sack of gold, it turns into a copy of Shimoneta, A Boring World with the Cuts that are Dirty Jokes doesn't exist at buyshimoneta.com.